I was unwrapping my sandwich in the break room when I saw them through the glass wall. Two people in dark blazers, clipboards in hand, standing directly in front of my desk. They weren't waiting. They were already inside. One of them was photographing my computer screen. The other had on latex gloves and was pulling open my desk drawers like I wasn't an employee, like I was evidence. My heart didn't race. It just clicked. So this was happening. Maribel had finally pulled the trigger. I watched for a few seconds. Long enough to be sure? Then walked back onto the floor. "Find anything interesting?" I asked calmly. The taller HR officer looked up. "Ms. Cole, we're conducting a routine compliance check based on reports of potential workplace violations." Routine? Of course. I didn't need to ask who filed the reports. Maribel Haynes was standing 2 cubicles away, pretending to reorganize a stack of papers while watching everything out of the corner of her eye. She'd been waiting for this moment for months. What kind of violations, I asked? Unprofessional conduct, documentation inconsistencies, possible process risks. The shorter officer read from his notes without looking at me. "We need to complete the inspection before you return to your workstation. Before I go any further, take a second and tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and if stories about quiet workplace battles and unexpected reversals speak to you. Make sure you're subscribed, because what unfolded next changed everything. My name is Rena Cole. I had been working at Northbridge Risk Solutions for just over 5 years, managing high-value corporate accounts, when I made a mistake. It wasn't a slap on the wrist. It was a financial problem. Maribel joined my team about 6 months after I did. From the beginning, she made it clear she believed my position should have been hers. She interrupted my calls to clarify points I'd already explained. She copied managers on emails correcting errors that didn't exist. She volunteered for my projects, then suggested changes that made no sense. What really bothered her, though, was that I stayed quiet when clients thanked me. I didn't broadcast it when deals closed smoothly. I didn't take credit in meetings. I just did the work. And because she couldn't compete with something she couldn't see, she started watching me closely, tracking my breaks, my habits, my patterns. She wasn't just being competitive. She was building a case. And while she was doing that, I was quietly creating something of my own, sitting right there in my desk, something HR was about to discover. Maribel didn't just watch me casually. She studied me, at first. It was subtle enough that most people wouldn't notice. She'd glance at the clock when I arrived, pause when I stood up to refill my coffee, walk past my desk just a little too often, pretending to check the printer or ask someone a question that could have waited. Then it escalated. She started asking questions that sounded harmless on the surface. "Do you always file client notes that way? Is it normal to update records after hours? Just curious, how long are your lunch breaks usually?" Every question came with a smile. Every smile carried an accusation. I realized early on that Maribel wasn't trying to learn how I worked. She was trying to catch me doing it wrong. So I let her. I began leaving tiny imperfections, not mistakes, just irregularities. An email that said Thursday instead of Friday. Corrected an hour later. A document saved in the wrong folder. Then quietly moved the next morning. A typo in an internal memo. Fixed before anyone else needed it. They were harmless, inconsequential. But to someone hunting for patterns, they were gold. I confirmed my suspicion one afternoon when I passed her desk on the way to the restroom and saw her screen still on. A folder sat open. Rena Cole Performance Documentation. Inside were screenshots, printed emails, handwritten notes in the margins describing my patterns. I didn't confront her. I didn't warn anyone. I just smiled and kept going. Because while Maribel was busy building her case, I was doing something else entirely. About a year and a half earlier, I had started keeping a small notebook in my desk drawer. Not for work, not officially. It was a personal habit I'd picked up after a stressful quarter. Every afternoon before leaving, I wrote down 3 positive moments from my day. Nothing dramatic, just real. A client thanking me for a clear explanation, a coworker staying late to help untangle a billing issue, a supervisor offering calm, constructive feedback instead of criticism. I wrote names, dates, details, not praise, gratitude. The notebook wasn't hidden. It sat in my drawer beside pens and sticky notes. Anyone opening it would see exactly what it was: honest observations of kindness, professionalism, and cooperation. Over time, patterns formed. Some names appeared often, people who consistently showed patience, fairness, or support. Other names appeared occasionally, and one name never appeared at all, not once. In more than 18 months of writing, through hundreds of entries documenting positive workplace interactions, Maribel Haynes was absent, not because I excluded her, but because there was nothing to write. I didn't realize it then, but that quiet notebook written for my own sanity had become something else entirely: a record. And now, as HR continued searching my desk during my break, one of them had just opened the drawer where it lived. I noticed the moment the inspection changed. Up until then, the HR officers had been efficient, detached. Photos, notes, checklists, the kind of routine that's designed to feel cold and procedural. Then the shorter one pulled the notebook from my drawer. "What's this?" he asked. "Personal notes?" I said evenly, "Nothing confidential." He flipped the cover open. At first, he skimmed. Just a few seconds. Then he slowed down. I watched his posture shift, the slight lean forward, the pause between page turns. He didn't say anything, but he angled the notebook so his partner could see. The taller officer stepped closer, read a few lines, then a few more. They didn't put it back. They sat down at my desk. That alone drew attention. Conversations around us softened. Keyboards stopped clicking. People started pretending to work while watching from the edges of their monitors. Maribel drifted closer, trying not to look obvious. The officers weren't scanning quickly anymore. They were reading carefully. Occasionally, one would tap a line and whisper something under his breath. Once, the taller officer nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd already suspected. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Finally, the shorter officer looked up at me. "Ms. Cole," he said, "how long have you been keeping this?" "About 18 months. "And these entries," he continued, "they're written as events occurred, not retroactively. Yes, not exaggerated." "No." They exchanged a look, not surprise. "Exactly. Recognition." Without another word. The taller officer closed the notebook halfway and turned away from my desk. "Ms. Haynes," he said, loud enough for the surrounding cubicles to hear. "Could we speak with you privately?" Maribel froze. For a second, I thought she might pretend not to hear. Then she forced a smile and nodded, gathering her things too quickly. They walked into the small glass-walled conference room at the end of the floor. From my desk, I could see everything. At first, Maribel was animated, talking with her hands, confident, leaning forward the way she always did when she thought she was winning. Then her movements slowed. Her shoulders tightened. Her mouth closed. The taller officer said something and slid the notebook across the table toward her. Maribel picked it up. Her eyes moved across the page. Then to the next. Her face changed, not anger, not embarrassment, something closer to panic. The meeting lasted nearly half an hour. When the door finally opened, Maribel stepped out first. Her eyes were red. Her posture was different, smaller. The officers followed and returned to my desk. "Miss Cole," the shorter one said, "after reviewing your workspace and documentation, we're closing this inspection. There are no policy violations." Relief washed through me, but I stayed quiet. "However," he added, "we did identify concerns not with your conduct, but with the circumstances that triggered this review." He tapped the notebook lightly. "In 18 months," he said, You documented positive interactions involving 62 individuals across this company. I nodded. One name appears 0 times. He didn't need to say it. I already knew. And now, so did everyone else. The officers didn't raise their voices. They didn't accuse anyone outright. That was the part that made it worse. The taller officer closed my notebook and looked at me. Ms. Cole, we'll need to retain this temporarily as part of our review. You'll receive a copy by the end of the day. Of course, I said. Then he turned back toward the open office. We're also scheduling follow-up conversations with several team members. He added calmly, this will not take long. That was when the room truly shifted. People straightened in their chairs. A few exchanged glances. No one spoke, but everyone understood what was happening. This inspection was no longer about me. The officers packed their materials and left the floor without another word. Maribel didn't return to her desk. Her chair remained empty for the rest of the afternoon. I finished my lunch and went back to work. Client calls, reports, the normal rhythm of the day. But underneath it, something had cracked open. Around 3:30, my manager, Evan Mercer, asked me to stop by his office. He didn't look angry. He didn't look concerned. He looked thoughtful. Rena, he said, closing the door, I want to be clear. This inspection was approved based on documentation presented to HR. But after what they found today, there are additional questions. I understand, I said. He studied me for a moment. How long have you been writing that journal? 18 months. And it was never shared, never. Evan nodded slowly. HR described it as unusually consistent. I almost smiled. They also mentioned, he continued, that your name appears frequently in positive client feedback and internal evaluations. More than most. I hadn't known that. That contrast raised flags. He said quietly, not about your work, about intent. He didn't say Maribel's name. He didn't have to. She requested the inspection happen while you were away from your desk. Evan added, specifically during your break. That landed harder than I expected. Not concern for the company, not process integrity, timing. I didn't ask for this. I said carefully, I know. Evan replied, that's part of the problem. The rest of the day passed slowly. People were polite, but more observant. Conversations felt measured, careful. The next morning, Maribel returned. She arrived exactly on time, sat down, opened her laptop. No greetings, no commentary, no corrections. It was like watching someone shrink inside their own skin. 3 days later, the real fallout began. HR started conducting one-on-one conversations across the department. Not about me, about team dynamics, collaboration, patterns. People talked, and when people are asked to reflect not on mistakes, but on contributions, the answers change. By the end of that week, Maribel was called into another meeting. This time, the door stayed closed for over an hour. She didn't come back to the floor afterward. I didn't feel victorious, but I felt something else. Validated. Because the thing she tried to use to destroy me wasn't a trap. It was a mirror. The office didn't explode after that meeting. There were no whispers in the hallway, no dramatic announcements, no emails marked urgent. What changed was quieter than that. People started paying attention. HR didn't frame their follow-up conversations as investigations. They called them culture check-ins. Questions were simple, almost gentle. Who do you collaborate with most? Who helps you when deadlines stack up? Who makes your work easier or harder? When you ask questions like that, patterns surface without force. By midweek, I noticed small shifts. Colleagues lingered longer at each other's desks. Thank yous were spoken out loud instead of buried in emails. People began acknowledging help in meetings, not as performance, but as habit. Maribel stood out immediately. She tried to adjust. I could see it. She smiled more, said thanks quickly, awkwardly, offered feedback that sounded rehearsed. But sincerity can't be learned overnight. Her compliments landed wrong. Her suggestions still carried an edge. When others collaborated, she hovered. When credit was shared, she redirected it back to herself. In a room that had started to value contribution over visibility, she felt out of sync. The following Monday, Lena Whitford from HR stopped by my desk. "Do you have a moment?" she asked. We sat in a small meeting room, neutral. Glass walls. No drama. "I want to be clear," she said. "Your journal was never the issue. It was the context it revealed." I nodded. "When someone documents others only to find fault," she continued, "and another person documents others only to recognize value, that contrast matters." She paused, especially when the documentation spans time. "What happens now?" I asked. Lena folded her hands. "We address alignment, not punishment." 2 days later, Maribel was reassigned, not fired, not demoted. Moved to a role with minimal collaboration, project tracking, internal metrics, isolated deliverables. Officially, it was described as better role fit. Unofficially, everyone understood. She packed her desk quietly. No speeches, no confrontation. She didn't look at me when she passed. I felt no triumph watching her go, just clarity. A week after that, Evan asked me into his office again. "I wanted you to hear this directly," he said. "The review confirmed something we hadn't articulated before. You stabilize this team." That word stayed with me. Not star, not stand out, stabilize. "You don't compete," he continued. "You create space where others do better work." I left his office feeling lighter than I had in months. The irony wasn't lost on me. Maribel had spent so long trying to prove I didn't belong that she had unintentionally documented exactly why I did. And all I had done was write down moments of gratitude after Maribel moved departments. The office settled into something unfamiliar, calm, not the tense quiet that follows conflict, but a steadier rhythm, like a machine finally running without friction. Meetings ended on time. Emails were shorter. People disagreed without bracing themselves for fallout. No one said her name, but everyone felt the difference. I kept my journal exactly where it had always been. Same drawer, same pen, same habit at the end of the day. But now, it meant something different. People knew it existed. They didn't avoid it. They leaned into it. Alicia from operations left a handwritten note on my desk one morning. For the journal. She'd written at the bottom. I smiled and added it that afternoon. A quiet thank you for clarity during a messy client call. Daniel from accounting began bringing extra coffee during late afternoons, not as a gesture, just because he noticed people were tired. Evan started opening weekly meetings with a brief acknowledgement. One sentence, no applause, no performance. Those small things added up, and they also revealed something else. When appreciation becomes visible, absence becomes louder. Maribel's new role kept her out of most conversations, but her reputation lingered, not as gossip as understanding. People didn't feel the need to explain why she'd been moved. They'd lived it. One afternoon, Lena from HR stopped by again. "We've updated our internal review framework," she said casually. "Nothing official yet, just perspective." She explained they were incorporating peer impact markers, not metrics. Not ratings, observations. Who reduces friction? Who increases it? It wasn't about being liked. It was about being usable. That night, I wrote something different in my journal. Not a name, a realization. That consistency outlasts performance. That quiet reliability becomes visible over time, especially when someone else is trying too hard to disprove it. A month later, Maribel submitted a transfer request to another branch. No farewell email, no announcement. She left the way she'd worked, focused on exit, not impact. On her last day, she paused at my desk. Just for a moment. "I didn't think it would turn out like this," she said. "I know," I replied. She nodded once and walked away. I didn't add her to the journal, not out of spite. Because gratitude isn't something you write to prove a point. It's something you earn. I still write every day, not because it protects me, but because it reminds me who I choose to be, even when no one is watching. Time has a way of finishing conversations that people start but never complete. In the weeks after Maribel left, I stopped being the person who was inspected and became something else entirely a reference point. New hires were introduced to me quietly, not with titles or praise, just a simple line from Evan. If you're unsure how something works, ask Rena. That mattered more than any formal recognition. HR's updated framework rolled out slowly. No announcement, no slide deck, just subtle changes in how feedback was gathered and discussed. Conversations shifted from what people delivered to how they affected others while delivering it. At first, some resisted. This isn't measurable. They said, this is subjective. But Lena had an answer ready. So is leadership, she'd replied. I noticed fewer interruptions in meetings, less posturing, more listening. When someone offered help, it was accepted without suspicion. When someone disagreed, they explained instead of escalating. It wasn't perfect, but it was human. One afternoon, Evan asked me to sit in on a peer review calibration meeting, not to speak, just to observe. What struck me wasn't the data. It was the language. People didn't say she's difficult anymore. They said working with her requires recovery time. They didn't say he's brilliant but intense. They said projects slow down around him. Those phrases told the truth without cruelty. After the meeting, Evan walked me back to my desk. You know, he said, the journal did something unexpected. What's that? It gave people permission to notice. That stayed with me, because noticing is dangerous. Once you start, you can't stop. You see who shows up consistently, who drains rooms, who makes work feel lighter, and who makes it feel heavier. Maribel had relied on the opposite, on people being too busy, too polite, too cautious to name patterns. She hadn't failed because she was ambitious. She failed because she never learned the difference between visibility and value. A few months later, I received a handwritten card in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single sentence I didn't know how to exist without competing. I folded it once and placed it in my desk drawer. Not in the journal. Some things aren't gratitude. They're closure. The journal is still there, still quiet, still ordinary. But now, when someone opens that drawer, whether it's HR, leadership, or me, it no longer feels like something fragile. It feels grounded, because the truth doesn't need defending when it's been lived consistently. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do in a workplace full of noise is document the good and let the rest reveal itself. The change didn't stop at our department. That was the part no one predicted. Once the language shifted, it traveled. Slowly at first. Then with momentum, teams that rarely interacted began borrowing the same questions HR had introduced. Who actually helps when things break? Who adds clarity? Who leaves a mess behind? None of it was framed as blame. That was the difference. When people stop defending themselves, they start telling the truth. I noticed it during a cross-functional review 2 months later. The room was full operations, compliance, analytics. Normally, those meetings were defensive chess matches. This time, they felt honest. Someone acknowledged a missed handoff without excuses. Another thanked a team that had covered quietly without recognition. At one point, a senior analyst said, I didn't realize how much time we spent managing personalities instead of work. No one laughed. They nodded. Afterward, Lena caught up with me in the hallway. We're seeing fewer escalations, she said. Fewer anonymous complaints. More direct conversations. That sounds healthier, I replied. It is, she said, but it's uncomfortable for people who relied on chaos. I knew who she meant. A few weeks later, I was asked to mentor a small group of team leads. Not formally, no title change, just a monthly conversation about process and pressure. During the first session, someone asked me what I'd done differently during the inspection. I didn't. I said, I just kept doing what I'd already been doing. They looked disappointed. People want tactics, frameworks, moves. They rarely want consistency. I told them about the journal, not the details. Just the habit, paying attention to what works, writing it down, letting time do the rest. One of them frowned. That sounds slow. It is, I said, but it's honest. A month later. Evan stopped by my desk with a folded document. Northbridge is piloting a new internal metric. He said, not performance-based, impact-based. He didn't need my approval. He wanted my reaction. The metric tracked friction, delays caused by rework, escalations tied to specific interactions, turnover patterns. The data was quiet and devastating. People who looked exceptional on paper showed up as bottlenecks. People who were invisible suddenly appeared everywhere, smoothing, stabilizing, carrying weight without credit. When the pilot results circulated privately among leadership, decisions followed, not dramatic ones, strategic ones, restructures, role clarifications, boundary setting, no villains, no heroes, just alignment. One afternoon, as I closed my journal, I realized something had shifted in me too. I no longer wrote because I needed proof. I wrote because I trusted time. And once you trust time, you stop rushing justice. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They arrived as clarity. Northbridge didn't announce reforms. Leadership didn't stand on stages or send triumphant emails. What happened instead was quieter policies rewritten in plain language. Reporting lines simplified. Expectations clarified until there was nowhere left to hide. People who thrived on ambiguity struggled. People who relied on pressure lost leverage. I saw it most clearly during performance reviews that fall. The questions had changed. Not what did you deliver, but what moved faster because of you. Not how visible were you, but who would notice if you weren't here. Some answers surprised even the people giving them. A senior manager admitted he hadn't realized how often his team stalled, waiting for his approval. Another acknowledged that her high standards were costing time and trust. No one was punished for saying it. That safety changed everything. After my review, Evan leaned back and said, "You know, you've been doing the same job for 5 years, but the job has finally caught up to you." I understood what he meant. The organization had learned how to see the kind of work I'd been doing all along. Weeks later, Lena invited me to a small offsite with HR leads. They wanted to understand how informal practices become culture, how something as small as a notebook could ripple outward. I told them the truth. It only worked because I wasn't trying to make it work. I said, the moment it becomes a strategy, people feel it. They asked what I would do differently if I started again. Nothing, I said, except trust it sooner. On my way back to the office that day, I ran into someone I hadn't seen in months, a former colleague who'd transferred out before all of this. "I heard things are different now," she said. "They are." I replied. She smiled, then hesitated. "I wish it had been like this earlier." "So do I," I said, that night. I opened my journal and read back through older entries. The early ones were careful, tentative. Later entries grew steadier, more confident. The people hadn't changed. I had. I'd stopped bracing, stopped shrinking, stopped waiting for permission to take up space quietly. The irony was sharp. Maribel had tried to expose weakness through scrutiny instead. She'd accelerated a system that made scrutiny irrelevant. I thought about her sometimes, not with resentment, but distance. She had been a catalyst, not an enemy, without her pressure. The truth might have stayed invisible longer. That didn't absolve her choices, but it explained their impact. As winter settled in, Northbridge felt lighter. Turnover dropped. Internal referrals rose. Complaints declined. Not because people became nicer, but because the cost of being careless with others became visible. One afternoon, as I slid my journal back into its drawer, I realized something else. The story wasn't about HR, or Maribel, or even me. It was about what survives inspection and what doesn't. I still work at Northbridge. Same building, same desk, same drawer. The journal is still there, every so often. Someone new joins the team and hears fragments of the story, not the details. Just the outline. There was an inspection once. Things changed after. They never ask me directly, and I never volunteer more than necessary. That's how these things last. The office no longer feels like a place where you have to guard your back. It feels like a place where patterns matter more than moments, where time does most of the talking. I've learned something important since all this happened. Most people believe accountability comes from confrontation, from exposing wrongdoing, from winning arguments in front of witnesses. But that's not how organizations really change. They change when incentives shift, when attention moves, when behavior becomes visible over time. Maribel didn't lose because she was wrong once. She lost because she was the same every day. So was I. The difference was what that consistency produced. I still write in the journal at the end of each day. Some entries are small. Some days there are only 1 or 2 lines. Sometimes I skip a day when work runs late or my head is full. It doesn't matter. What matters is that the record exists, not as evidence, as memory. A reminder that work is made of people, and people leave traces whether they intend to or not. A few months ago, Evan stopped by my desk as he was heading out. "You know," he said, "we haven't had a single anonymous complaint in weeks." "That's good," I replied. He nodded. "It is. It means people feel seen." After he left, I sat for a moment before packing up. The office was quiet in that end-of-day way, lights dimming, chairs emptying, the hum of systems winding down. I thought about how close everything had come to tipping the other way, how easily the inspection could have become a stain instead of a turning point, and how little I'd actually done to steer it. I hadn't argued. I hadn't defended myself. I hadn't tried to look impressive. I just lived my work the same way I always had. Sometimes, that's enough. Not to win, but to endure. And in the long run, endurance shapes everything else. What this story taught me is something simple, but powerful. You don't have to fight to prove your value. When you show up the same way every day, time does the explaining for you. Consistency, kindness, and quiet integrity leave a trail that speaks louder than any argument ever could. As you were listening, how did this story make you feel? Did you stay with me all the way to the end? Was there a moment or detail that really stuck with you? And where are you listening from right now? If this story meant something to you, I'd truly love to read your thoughts in the comments. A like or share helps more than you might think. And subscribing lets us keep telling stories like this together. 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 Stories like this